Good morning, and happy 500th anniversary of the Reformation. It is great to be with you this morning to celebrate. I am grateful to Pastor Molly for the invitation and to the leadership team here at FCCB. It always feels like coming home to return to FCCB, the place where my inauguration as president of PSR was held and celebrated, the place that has had a long connection with Pacific School of Religion, as together we have sought to serve in the world and in the church. I am grateful for the ways in which our connections strengthen both of our community work together. As I look out here and as I was welcoming and seeing folks coming in, I am always impressed by the many connections between PSR and FCCB, especially embodied in people who have served on our board, of those of you who are currently serving on our board, of folks who have been to PSR as students or are parents of those who were, of ways in which you have hosted and received our students here. I want to invite those who are currently students at PSR, I see a whole row of them back there, to please stand so we can acknowledge you who are being prepared for ministry within the church and the society. We are grateful for you. I can tell you that as we come to this 500th anniversary of this Reformation, it is the lives of commitment of those who seek their preparation to ministry that really heartens me about the sense of what lies ahead for the church in this moment of transformation. Seminaries are creatures of the church. The word seminary actually means seedbed. It is a place where you would take seeds and plant them so that they can grow just enough so that then they can be transplanted into new soil so that they may grow. You have been, as a congregation, a place that has sent seeds into the seedbed that is Pacific School of Religion. And you have also been a place that has received those who have grown in their ministry and preparation to continue their development and growth, whether it is in their educational program here or serving this congregation and those around us. So for that partnership, I am grateful, and I continue to ask for your prayers as we think about the work that lies ahead in the preparation of leaders for the church and the society at an extremely critical time. Later today, we'll have a chance to have a bit of a conversation about what I intended to call Reformation in the Age of Acceleration. So I encourage you to join a further conversation a little bit about that and what is it that we are called to do as we prepare leaders within our congregation and our community, not only to provide leaders for the church, but to lead the church and the society together. Please join me in a word of prayer as we reflect on today's text. May the words of my mouth and the meditation in our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our God and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, y'all, I am officially middle-aged. Other than the fact that my two teenage kids sitting right on the back pew over here remind me of it daily, I wake up at 3 a.m. with the weight of the world on my shoulders. I remember as a child always puzzling when my parents would say they had a hard time sleeping. It just didn't make any sense to me. You just lay down and go to sleep. And you wake up whenever somebody comes to shake you, so you head out to school. In the opening lines of the poem, The Peace of Wild Things, poet and activist Wendell Berry shows that he knows a thing or two about being middle-aged. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's life may be. I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I'm free. Those first lines, when despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's life may be, resonate in our reading today from the story of Jacob in Genesis. Jacob is clearly middle-aged in this text. He is grappling with the consequences of the decisions he made as a young man when he cheated his brother of his inheritance, and because of that was on the run for most of his life. But he has come to a place in middle age when he knows he must return to his brother and find a way for reconciliation. He has come to the place as a middle-aged man in the middle of the night to realize that he must wrestle with the seeds he sowed as a child, as a young man, and seek reconciliation. He knows that whatever success he has been able to accomplish in his life, all the things he has been able to accumulate, the blessing he was able to run away with, cannot be fully realized in isolation from those from where he came. Things have gotten significantly more complicated for Jacob than when he took off from his brother, hanging on to a blessing he exchanged for a bowl of soup, in a scene that is reminiscent of the evacuations out of the path of fires and storms in the last couple of weeks. In today's text, Jacob is gathering everything he can that he has and sending it across this river as he heads to meet his brother. In today's text, he is sending his wives, his children, his servant, and all of his possessions across a river. Middle-aged, in the middle of the night, he finds himself in this liminal space. That's a good seminary word for you. Liminal space, the in-between spaces that a doorway represents. That in-between space often captured and represented in the sacred text by rivers. This oddity where water flows in the midst of land. This space we are called into by our ancestors as they knew a moment of great transition and taught us to sing, "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." Join me now. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Jacob is facing that in-between space. Middle age, in the middle of the night, he must wrestle with his own past. This is the blessing, says Jan in her poem. This is the blessing that comes after you have left everything behind, after you have stepped out, after you have crossed into that realm beyond every landmark you have known. Jacob's task in the middle of the night is more than a physical task of getting his stuff across the river, although there is that physical work of returning home and dealing with it. But Jacob is engaged in a generation after generation theological task. The theological task of every generation. In this first ever recorded all-nighter, Jacob must wrestle with the question of reconciling himself with his past. This is the story that began with Cain and Abel, one that did not end so well. And every sibling pair in the scriptures from there on in the book of Genesis must wrestle with how to reconcile themselves with their siblings. Ishmael and Isaac must figure out a way to reconcile the blessing that will come to one and not the other in the way they are framing the world. Jacob himself began his life named, this is what happens when you name your children odd things like leg puller. That's what the word Jacob means. Because he was born holding on to Esau, his older brother's heel, as they were born. From the very beginning of their life, they knew that it was going to be their task too, to wrestle with this task of figuring out how we both are true to who we are, but engage meaningfully with others around us. Jacob has both a physical and a theological task that every generation must do. His own children would have the same wrestling to do. As Joseph, the 11th one, is the one he shows favor to. Did you notice this in Scripture? You know, the law says that the oldest child should receive the blessing. It never happens. In every single story, the actual narrative counters that because it is always the second-born or the younger one who ends up being more adept, better at leading the nation than the firstborn might be. And what they have to figure out is a way to wrestle with each other without killing one another to find their way forward. Similarly, we find ourselves as a church, as a society, living in that in-between space between what the law might say and the reality of people's lives and their narratives. And we must wrestle in that gap between the two. That is our theological task. It is the theological task of every immigrant who, like Joseph himself in the story that follows Jacob, one of his sons, Joseph, who has this altercation with his siblings. They are separated, and at the end of his life, when he has become as successful as an immigrant could possibly become, when he finally comes clean with his brothers and tells him who he is, the first words out of his mouth are, "Is my father still alive?" No matter how much he has been able to accomplish in his life, Joseph, like his father Jacob, knows that no matter how much wealth, well-being, or assimilation he has accomplished, he must do this task of reconciliation with his past to be true to himself. This is the theological task embarked by a theology student at Wittenberg 500 years ago. To wrestle with the question of what of the legacy of the church he loved could be carried into a future ahead, and what of it needed to be let go of. Penning 95 rather obnoxious theses, he nailed them to the door of the church and invited conversation about the things he was claiming and thinking about, inviting in a critical way the importance that we may talk with one another, that we may do our theological task together. The task he had before him 500 years ago, similar to the task we have today, is not to try to return to some imagined past greatness, to make the church great again, if you would, but to faithfully imagine a thriving new future for the church. The wrestling we must do as the Reformation movement is middle-aged as well, is to figure out how we might reconcile ourselves with those siblings we have split up from. In what ways the focus of our reform and our righteousness may get in the way of our ability to give a witness to the world that is already tired of division and separation. But rather to find a way in which we faithfully demonstrate and seek a way to wrestle with the legacy of the things we have done and have acquired. How do we wrestle with the things that we have inherited in our legacy of traditions, of buildings, of witness, to find a way to speak anew a reimagined future for the church. Of course, you don't have to be middle-aged to wake up in a sweat in the middle of the night these days. Fires, storms, earthquakes, DACA, healthcare, nuclear tensions, homelessness, refugee crisis, white supremacist rallies. There is plenty to keep us up in the middle of the night. Our generation, and by that I don't mean the year you were born and the bracket you're put into, but I mean this moment for the church today, all of us. Our generation must wrestle with tectonic shifts around us. In technology, in globalization, in the environment, in ethnic and cultural diversity. We must wrestle with deep divides that threaten the very existence of the institutions and communities we care deeply about. In a way, we are middle-aged as a nation, grappling with the consequences of our actions early in our life as a nation, when we dealt a horrible hand to some of our siblings by enslaving some of them, by removing from their land others, and now we must wrestle with the consequences of those actions just as Jacob must, and with the accumulated legacy of wealth and complexity that those early actions have done in our relationships to one another. Yes, we must wrestle through the night, because this will not be done easily. If you have a sense in the pit of your stomach, some days when you wake up, either at 3 a.m. or in the morning, it is because we are in the midst of this theological task of wrestling. This is no easy task. We must wrestle to find the solutions for our day as previous generations have. Padded answers will not work. New ways must be discovered. New paths created. Our very gate reshaped, the poem says. Our identity transformed. We must learn to be Israel, God wrestlers. Imagine this. This is the name for people of faith. It is God wrestlers. Now, while we do that, we must keep a bit of the leg pulling of Jacob with us as well, lest we take ourselves a little too seriously. So do be sure to join us this afternoon for some beer and hymns, just so we celebrate the Reformation in appropriate ways. We must wrestle with the expectations, with the realities of inequalities, with the challenges before us, and to find a way in which we carry this legacy anew. We have plenty of folks to learn from in our scriptures. Just like Jacob, who wrestled in the night, we can learn from the Syrophoenician woman. That woman who represents the people who live in those in-between liminal spaces. The one who is a hybrid. The one who is a border crosser, who comes to Jesus concerned for her daughter and is received with this horrendous statement that has baffled theologians for a long time. It is not right to take the children's food and give it to the dogs. That's Jesus for you. She did not stay with that. Yes, Lord, she said. But even the dogs deserve the crumbs that fall off the master's table. She taught Jesus by being willing to wrestle with the realities of inequality she saw in her world. The Syrophoenician woman is now embodied by those people who run across borders, convinced that they too have a right to at least the crumbs of the global table we have set for ourselves. She is embodied in the people who are simply not going to put up with violence against their communities by those who should protect them. It is embodied even in very complex ways by those who claim a space under a bridge, by a street, with a tent, to say there is room in this world for me as well. How do we wrestle with this theological task? At Pacific School of Religion, our hope is to be able to engage precisely in these types of conversations, to think about three things that we hope we can do in every experience we engage: to blow your mind, to embolden your heart, and to strengthen your hands. The work of theological education, like the work of the church, should help blow our mind and reframe the way we think about the issues of our day. In an article on Friday by David Brooks in the New York Times, he talks about the desperate need for a new way of thinking morally about the issues of our day in a way that is cohesive and compelling. We must blow our minds and think differently in some compelling way that is not simply saying, "not Trump," but that indicates a way forward for us. We must wrestle together to find ways to gather in community so that our heart is emboldened and our work sustained. We need grit. We need resilience. We need deep spiritual practices that will sustain us through this time. And individual personal practices are critical but not sufficient. We must gather in community and follow the old adage that all politics is local. Our community fabric is based on our gathering together across the table to eat, whether that table is the altar we share communion at or the table in our homes when we get to know our neighbors and not only those who think and are like us. We must strengthen our hands. We've got to get better at what we are called to do. We must find ways to do this work anew and better, to be church in a new way in this world. We must find ways, and we can, when we wrestle through the night, because we know that the one we wrestle with is staying up with us through the night. If those three things, to blow your mind, embolden your heart, and strengthen your hands, sound familiar, it's because I'm taking them out of Deuteronomy. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Brothers and sisters, it is worth noting that the text we heard today is no Western. Jacob does not get to walk victoriously into the sunset, as you would if it was John Wayne and not Jacob. Instead, he limps into the dawn with the promise of a new day. Even though he has wrestled with God, and God has been up with him all night. And the wrestling, while left him hurt, invites him to walk into a new day. So when this blessing comes, born in the hands of the difficult angel who has chosen you, do not let go. Give yourself into its grip. It will wound you. But I tell you, there will come a day when what felt to you like limping was something more like dancing, as you moved into the cadence of your new and blessed name. Amen.